The marathon is one of the most difficult races anyone can compete in. It requires so much physical and mental grit just to even finish. And as someone who has ran a couple, I can safely say it is tough. But the 1904 Olympic Marathon took that to a whole different level. The race took place in St. Louis, and a lot of the participants weren't even in marathon shape. Some of them have ran marathons before, such as the Boston Marathon, but a lot of them hadn't even ran a marathon in their entire life and were instead middle distance runners. So the lineup was very interesting. For example, two men from South Africa didn't even have shoes on when they showed up to the starting line. But one participant, Felix Carvajal, is the character who really takes the cake. A former mailman who hailed all the way from Cuba, Felix had made it to New Orleans to eventually get to the St. Louis race. But once he got to New Orleans, he lost all his money from gambling and drinking. So as a result, he had to hitchhike his entire way to St. Louis since he didn't have any money. But to make matters even worse, when he showed up at the start line, the man was wearing dark, long pants and walking shoes. Mind you, the race was in the afternoon and was already 90 degrees Fahrenheit. Funny enough, one of the other runners actually cut the dark pants into jorts, so yay for sportsmanship. The race was 24.85 miles long, and the terrain mostly consisted of dirt roads, with plenty of thick stones that could hurt the runners' feet. They also ran up and down 7 steep hills that had a 100 to 300 foot incline, with one runner saying the terrific hills could simply tear a man to pieces. The gun went off at 3:03 p.m. Which, why the fuck would it start that late? Most marathons typically start at 7 or 8 a.m. when, it's a little bit colder. But as the men started, they knew they were in for a treat. Throughout their almost 25-mile journey, they had to dodge traffic, trolleys, and pedestrians. And to make matters worse, coaches drove in front of their athletes in a car, kicking up dust from the 7-inch deep dirt roads. And if you've ever experienced breathing in clouds of dirt while running, you know it's totally painful. Also, you know how marathons typically have an aid station every mile or so with Gatorade, water, and sometimes gels? Well, James Sullivan, the chief organizer of the games, this guy, decided to say fuck all that. The jerk wanted to use this race as a way of testing the limits of dehydration. So he thought, what better way to do this than to test it on the marathon runners? And so he did. As a result, the runners only got 2 water aid stations, a water tower at mile 6 and a well at mile 12. That's like a war crime in sports. I mean, they didn't even have any water for the last half of the race. Sullivan, that was not cool, man. As the runners trekked on through the race, they were also denied any water from the people in the cars. The first person to succumb to the dust was William Garcia, a runner from California. He collapsed on the side of the road because the dust had overloaded his esophagus and eventually had ripped his stomach lining. As you can imagine, he was hospitalized, but luckily, he made it out okay. I could not imagine the amount of pain that guy was going through. Running a marathon in 90-degree weather is already terrible, but imagine having that pain be so much worse because you're dehydrated and literally dust is overloading your system. It's awful. One of the runners from South Africa, Lin Tao, actually got chased off course by a pack of dogs, and another runner who won the Boston Marathon in 1903 gave up after vomiting. Sam Mellor, the guy who won Boston Marathon in 1902, was leading the pack, but he eventually gave up after having severe cramps. His lead was taken over by American runner Thomas Hicks. But I bet you're wondering, what about our boy Felix? Well, at first he was just vibing. Along the run, he would stop by and talk with pedestrians, kind of shooting the shit with them. He was having a good old time. But at one point in the race, he was getting pretty hungry, so he stopped a car that was full of peaches. And of course, he asked for one, but the driver was like, no can do. So Felix took that a little bit personally, and so he stole 2 peaches from the car. Dude's a straight up madman. Apparently that didn't satisfy his appetite because eventually he stopped by a tree full of apples and started eating them. Unfortunately though, the apples were rotten. So what does Felix do? He lays down and takes a nap mid-race. Could you imagine if an Olympic runner did that today? That would make so many headlines. Like imagine Eliud Kipchoge just mid-race taking a nap. That would just be crazy. At around mile 9, Fred Loris, an American runner, started to feel cramps as well. But instead of being an honest man and dropping out, he instead gets into one of the cars that was accompanying him and hitches a ride. And as that car was passing the other runners, he was waving at them. Dude, if I was one of those runners, I'd be so fucking pissed. Like, you got clouds of dirt, you got heat that is unbearable, you got these steep hills, the race is just awfully coordinated, and now he has one of the runners cheating, waving at you as he passes by. Meanwhile, at mile 10, Hicks was deep in the pain cave. He begged his vehicle for some water, but they still refused, and instead they decided to stuff his mouth with a sponge full of warm distilled water. That is absolutely disgusting. I cannot imagine doing that to someone. That is actually inhumane. They also fed him egg whites and strychnine, a pesticide that is used to kill like small animals like birds and squirrels. They fed him poison in the middle of the race. That is crazy. Fun fact though, that was apparently the first recorded use of drugs in the Olympics, so yay, I guess? But while Hicks was being fed poison in the middle of the race, Loris hopped out of his car at around mile 11 and continued running. He was ordered to get off the course by one of Hicks's handlers, but he was determined and kept on going. And 13 miles later, he was the first one to cross the finish line. Most of the crowd didn't know that Loris had cut the course, but as Alice Roosevelt, President Teddy Roosevelt's 20-year-old daughter, was lowering the gold medal onto his neck, a random member in the audience basically crashed the ceremony and said, "Cheater." Immediately, a huge distaste swept through the crowd. The cheering went from hoorays and wahoos to straight up boos.
Oh, brother, this guy stinks!
Loris, however, tried to play this all off and said he was going to take the medal as a joke and actually reveal that he had hitched a ride. I'm sure you were going to do that, Loris. I'm sure you were. So, Loris was disqualified from the race. That means the gold medal was still up for grabs. Hicks was now the front runner, but at this point, he was barely able to keep a running pace. I mean, he was so exhausted. Remember, he was fed poison, the heat was awful, he was dehydrated, the dirt roads were making everything worse, of course. He was just struggling. So to help that, the trainers gave him more egg whites and more poison, and of course soaked him with warm water. He was hurting so bad that he was hallucinating, believing that he had still 20 miles to go, when in reality, he only had about 2 miles to go. On the last mile, he was basically a walking zombie. He was dead tired. He was begging his trainers for food. He was wanting to lie down. It was rough. But eventually, he made his way to the stadium and had his trainers carry him over the finish line. Dude was not looking good at all. But nonetheless, Thomas Hicks, the American runner, had won fair and square. A win that nearly costed him his entire life and shredded 8 pounds off of his weight. He ran a time of 3:28, the slowest marathon win in Olympic history. But with the obstacles in mind, the 90-degree weather, the steep hills, the dirt road you're always breathing in, basically having no water throughout the entire race, and of course being fed poison, I think it's a pretty remarkable time. And in case you're wondering what happened to Felix, he eventually woke up from his nap and actually placed 4th. What a guy. The fact that he was able to place 4th while also taking a nap and being poisoned by rotten apples is just remarkable. So props to Felix as well. But that is the story of the 1904 Olympic Marathon. I hope you all enjoyed. Please be sure to like and subscribe. Do you have any crazy marathon stories you'd like to tell us? Please drop a comment down below. See y'all next time.